The idea of our data traveling the internet and where it's going, and with every data breach, the loss of personal identifiable information that possesses tremendous risk, and with every breach, an apology following, but really no action beyond that, it really is bringing to light this notion of how do we protect our personal identifiable information. As consumers, I think we've found a voice, and the regulators are responding with a call to action.
Welcome to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you are a developer, an entrepreneur, crypto enthusiast, or just trying to learn more about how distributed ledger technology and Hedera Hashgraph will impact your industry, then you'll love the episodes that we have coming up. Bookmark us, add us to your podcast app, and stay tuned.
Hey there, and welcome to Hedera Hashgraph, Gossip About Gossip. I'm Paul Madsen, your sometimes regular host. Hedera and Armanino authored a white paper recently on GDPR and similar privacy regulations. In that paper, I acknowledge I was somewhat waving my hands, but I speculated on the possibility of Hedera Consensus Service, HCS, playing a role in enabling privacy compliance, specifically recording key moments of privacy and consent receipts, et cetera, so that the enterprise in question could prove it later. And I confess at the time I was unaware that a really cool dApp was emerging that was exploring that very same use case. So I'm super excited to talk today to Manitou, specifically to Nate Rand and Terry Keene from Manitou. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul.
Very, very serendipitous synergy between the white paper, as I say, where I was sort of waving my hands, and then Manitou emerging to make that use case real. How about introducing yourself? Tell me about yourself.
Sure. Happy to start. It's Nate. My background is heavily in the financial services space. I spent over 20 years at a large global custodian, namely in their capital markets divisions, trading and touching clients in a number of different products. And sometime in and around 2016, I started getting enamored with blockchain and the thought of creating digital assets. So enamored that I found new friends at the custodian bank that I'm now working with as part of Manitou, who are technology engineers. And together we focused on distributed ledger technology and how we would kind of remake and re-platform the financial services organization to support new asset classes and existing ones in more efficient ways. And Terry and I were there together doing that. And what we recognized is, even at that time, identity and understanding who's on either side of a transaction was kind of a critical place to focus and a critical place to drive capability, because you could bring about efficiencies, kind of understanding personal preferences and behaviors. And then came about privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA and others globally. An opportunity presented itself for us to start Manitou and build a privacy management solution in recognition of this kind of burgeoning marketplace around data privacy.
And I'm Terry Keene. Thank you very much, Paul, for inviting us to join you. It has been rather serendipitous on both sides, because on several occasions as we built out Manitou, we talked about the plausibility of having a level of validation that we had not seen to this point. And as Nate said, the team that we put together at Manitou has a tremendous amount of depth in blockchain and Hyperledger specifically. In fact, the founders of Hyperledger are on the team. So we always recognized that was a possibility, but we really didn't see a path to it. My background has been basically as an entrepreneur most of my life. I've had hardware companies, software startups, consulting, integration, spent about 10 years supporting high frequency traders on Wall Street. That was a lot of fun. Basically, I felt like the weapons dealer in a war. But as a result, when the team started Manitou, I was very interested in the project. I was terribly excited about the team because we'd worked with them both at London Stock Exchange and at State Street. And so I could see nothing but really good stuff. coming out of this group. And so I joined them primarily to help them with product strategy. And walking down this path, again, after several discussions about the possibility of finding some level of validation and transparency in the transaction process, Nate started talking to us about the connection he had made with Hadera when we were back in the blockchain days, and we put the team together, and it just turned out we fit like a dovetail connection. So it's pretty exciting.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Nate. You mentioned the fact that the teams stayed together for some time. I was listening to another podcast that, is it your CEO or CTO Moise Gahari did? It was clear that there's a connection there that has transcended different corporate boundaries. Terry, you cited the Hyperledger experience and expertise of the team, but I wouldn't characterize Manitou as a blockchain solution, right? You're a compliance solution that happens to use a DLT underneath. Is that fair?
Well, I'm not even sure we have embraced DLT internally. There are some things that distributed ledgers do exceptionally well, and I think beyond the capability of anything else. For instance, Bitcoin could never have existed without something like a hyperledger, so without something like a distributed ledger. But from the standpoint of the product that we're rolling out, which is basically a privacy compliance product designed specifically to allow consumers to manage their own privacy data, the distributed ledger, at the level we were collecting and managing and encrypting and controlling personal data for companies and their consumers, a distributed ledger really didn't fit that architecture model. But again, what we created was, and I'm sure we'll get into this as we go on, but what we created was a log, we'll call it, that tracks every transaction, and that log is immutable, and it cannot be accessed by anyone except with special rights. So we kind of assumed that would be a really good validation and for compliance, for audit, for legal validation. But the more we thought about it, basically the question always becomes, yeah, but you guys own it, you hold it, you control it, what keeps you from messing with it? So having an external public ledger as a validation platform made a great deal of sense. And that in particular is another wonderful specific use case for a distributed ledger, in your case, a public ledger.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe let's step back a bit. Nate, could you summarize what GDPR and CCPA require of enterprises with respect to the consumer data or their customer data?
Sure, there are many aspects about both of the regulations, and they do differ slightly. But as it relates to what we're doing at Manitou in realization of those regulations, is the notion that personal identifiable information that defines us as individuals or as consumers really should be put in control of the person that it defines. And the regulations, in fact, create those rights and empower consumers to reach out to the corporations and service providers that they rely on and ask questions like, what data do you hold on me? What are you doing with my data? Are you selling it to third parties? And then after understanding how their data is being used, giving those individuals the legal right to update the data, make changes to the data, or delete it, request for its complete deletion. And that's one aspect of the regulations. And what we have come to recognize is tracking personal identifiable data across an enterprise, across a corporation, is not easy. And it's not something that these organizations have ever had to do before. Today, to understand where that information sits, it's often a manual approach or a very kind of defined, methodical manual process that takes hours to just collect and find the information to even engage the consumer as to what's being held and how it's being used. With Manitou, we're able to build connectors into enterprise target systems, deploy machine learning models, and really serve up for the enterprise where that PII sits in their target applications. And just the discovery of that information alone is a tremendous efficiency gain for the organization. And then secondarily, we enable the enterprise to share that information with their consumers in a very easily accessed online self-service portal. And from there, the consumer can see what's held and can request changes. And should the enterprise want, they can either review those changes before updates are made or allow those updates to radiate back through our connectors right into the target systems and in near real time, make the requisite updates. Back to your notion around blockchain, we really feel that we create that single source of truth for the organization around what PII they hold on their consumers. And a second notion around blockchain, the idea around encryption and granting accessibility around that heavily protected data through cryptography and key distribution. Those are aspects that are inherent in our platform that we won't claim as being a blockchain or a DLT solution, but they're very core tenets and characteristics of a blockchain that we're building our platform around. And let me extend that just one step further into our work with Hedera. With Hedera's ability to distribute information, in our case, validation of actions through a public network, it's very complementary to what we're doing, and it's extension of what we're doing. And the validation just brings greater trust and comfort around the solution that we're bringing to bear in light of GDPR and CCPA and other data privacy regulations.
As you described the components of the solution, the ability to pull data from various sources, AI and machine learning analysis of that data, self-service portal. I'm actually encouraged, or I'm happy to hear that Hedera's piece is but one piece of that puzzle, right? Those components have really nothing to do with Hedera. It's the fact that we can allow you to establish that log, that trusted log, to Terry's point, that you don't own, but rather Hedera collectively owns to some extent. That's our contribution to your solution. And I like, that we play that very specific, to some extent, small role within the solution.
Well, Paul, if you think about it, the complexity of identifying and then cataloging or mapping personal information inside an organization becomes more complex the longer that organization's been around. And I didn't realize until I really sat down and started thinking about scaling and longevity. We just did a webinar where one of the participants had been the chief security officer at the Bank of England. And he said, we had 15 million clients and we're a 100-year-old institution. And he said, and so you can imagine that more than 100 years ago, there weren't computers, so everything was done on paper. Imagine the complexity of finding personal information in all of those documents that have been stored away in boxes. And we were at State Street for basically helping build out blockchain technology there. And State Street is a 260-year-old organization that has almost 500,000 handwritten contracts in boxes in warehouses. How do you go through that and decide what is extendable into today's privacy regulation that you have to account for? And so consider the number of Excel spreadsheets that are out there with personal information in them, where people have actually gone out and drawn information out of multiple databases to do analysis. So you have the personal information in each database, and then you have personal information that's now been created and accumulated in a standalone document, an Excel spreadsheet, or printed off as a PDF somewhere. It gets incredibly complex. And so pulling all that together and creating a trusted source, which is what Manitou is specifically trying to do, how do you make that provable? And that's really kind of the question that we were asking. So if we turn this over to the consumer and give them the ability to actually go in and see what data an organization has on them and see how that organization's using the data, and then allowing permission or even requesting to be completely forgotten, which are all among these privacy regulations. How do you ensure that all of that happens? And how do you then ensure to not only the consumer, who is the most important person in this chain, but also to regulators and auditors, and specifically, if you come under litigation for failing to do that, how do you prove to the litigators that in fact you executed the transactions that you were asked to execute, and in fact those transactions were really requested, and that was the tenor of the request, and that you committed those into the databases. That's a terribly difficult process. And we think that the fact that we've enlisted Hedera and joined forces on this is going to be a tremendous plus, something that no one else is doing. So that's really unique.
It's in this world of GDPR, it's not enough to do the right thing. You have to be able to prove you did the right thing.
Oh, yeah.
So why Hedera? If your requirement is to be able to record this log, did you explore other DLTs?
I think what was unique about Hedera were a couple things. I think the hash algorithm, how you validate and prove that an event has happened, is incredibly unique. I think we're aligned organizationally with the fact that we are both trying to provide enterprise-grade solutions to corporations. Our alignment there, just combined, allows us to tell a very robust story collectively to our client base and your council. We're looking forward to solving problems in and around data privacy for both of our clients using both of our combined capabilities.
I think, as Nate said, one of the real attractive parts of Hadera is the speed of transactions. Because if you've ever worked with a distributed ledger, you know that in order to get a proof of entry for all the transactions, it can be a rather lengthy and arduous process that takes a lot of time. And you guys have pretty much solved that problem, which is really interesting. But I think the second, and to me, probably the most important aspect of Hadera is the fact that you are sponsored by a very significant group of companies who have a very solid reputation to withhold and are, for all intents and purposes, overseeing the independence and the transparency that Hadera is shooting for. And that gives me personally a lot of comfort, but I think that's one of the things that turned the tide for Manitou in selecting Hadera as being our source of validation.
It's great to hear. I mean, yeah, you're referring to the council members that govern Hedera, that own Hedera technically, the sorts of enterprises that are confronting the very same GDPR requirements that your solution can help address. What about COVID? Do you imagine COVID changing consumer expectations or requirements around privacy? It's been often said that, users don't necessarily care about privacy till they've lost it. Will COVID change that?
I think what COVID did was created what I would consider the height of paranoia. We are all now suspect of everything. And that basically causes us to think more clearly and in more depth about what's going on in our personal life. And now that we have social media, where we are dramatically exposed, and we're discovering that that's quite an exposure, and with our concern about personal privacy and our concern about personal health, I think everything is going to come under a much deeper view in a much stronger magnifying glass than we've ever done before. And I think personal privacy is going to be among those.
I would agree with Terry. I think the idea of our data traveling the internet and where it's going, and with every data breach, the loss of personal identifiable information that possesses tremendous risk, and with every breach, an apology following, but really no action beyond that, it really is bringing to light this notion of how do we protect our personal identifiable information. As consumers, I think we've found a voice, and the regulators are responding with a call to action with regulations like CCPA and GDPR. But what COVID did is it brought to light, how do we effectively contact trace and do it in a way that we're not revealing too much information about individual people and further exacerbating that area of concern. And when you look globally around how various countries and nations have gone about this, some have done their tracing kind of more publicly, and it's resulted in social shaming and further concerns around identity leakage. And what we're trying to solve here domestically is how do we effectively trace without giving up that personal identifiable information. And this problem is only worsening in ways because now we're living our work lives completely online, working from home. And our actions, our identities, what we do is being captured electronically more than ever before. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just a matter of governing it and controlling it, protecting it, that I think will enable us to kind of become an even more digital society, but make sure we're fulfilling the moral obligation around things like personal privacy.
Digital but paranoid, to Terry's point.
That's exactly
Yes.
right.
Yes.
And you know, Paul, a lot of enterprises really, especially in the United States, really aren't taking this terribly seriously yet, because honestly, it hasn't hit in the U.S. yet. Now, in Europe, GDPR has had some significant penalties assessed. In fact, one of our presenters on the webinar said that he had heard that Experian had actually been fined €75,000 because someone requested a data subject access request, which is what we call the request from a consumer. And the organ and Experian came back to them and said, "We're sorry, but that's way too hard. It's too complicated, and we just can't pull that all together." And the Spanish regulators came in and said, "No, that's not acceptable. That'll cost you €75,000. But Brazil's privacy program goes into effect next month, which is tomorrow. CCPA, in fact, the penalties begin tomorrow. But behind CCPA, just in the United States, there are 28 states that have enacted new laws. And coming online right behind California is Nevada has already passed their law, which is very close to CCPA. New York has passed a law that is very close to CCPA, but worse. Washington State is working on one that we'll call more GDPR-like. Illinois is a CCPA, but worse. And when I say but worse, the context of that meaning is with CCPA, and there's a little bit of difference between GDPR and CCPA. In GDPR, the way the European regulators have decided to handle this is an organization, an enterprise has to actually reach out to the consumer and ask for permission of the consumer to use their data. So it's what we call an opt-in kind of a solution where the consumer has to actually agree. In California, CCPA is more what we call an opt-out. And what that means is an organization can use the consumer's data unless the consumer comes in and specifically says, you can't use that data, or you can use it for this, but not for that. So very different kind of prospects. Washington State is coming out with one that is a GDPR-like opt-in. Nevada, New York, they're more CCPA, but Illinois, New Hampshire are both coming out with what we'll call CCPA, but worse. And that means the regulation of CCPA, but forcing organizations to reach out to their consumers and ask for permission. And so it's slowly but surely unfolding, and not unlike GDPR, which took about a year to really kick into gear and get people take it seriously. I think we're going to see the same thing in the United States. As more states come out with this, more people are going to be affected by it. More people are going to come in and say, we don't want you messing with our personal data. Don't pass it around. Don't sell it. And don't use it to reach out to me. I don't want to see your marketing anymore. I think people are going to realize once they come to the realization that they actually can do that, I think you're going to see more and more people stepping up. And in fact, in an analysis that Cisco did, they discovered that about a third of the people who have public personal data in the system have begun reaching out and asking what that data is and what you'll do about it. So it is coming to reality.
You say, but worse, but I think from the user's point of view, it's for better, right? Ultimately.
Oh, much better. Absolutely.
And for Manitou as well, right? Because it imposes arguably a more serious burden and requirement on the enterprise, and therefore justifies your solution that much more.
Indeed. And for Hedera as well, because we're going to put the badge of honor on the transaction.
Right.
Hedera will be our badge of honor.
At the end of the day, we don't particularly care what that transaction represents, whether it's opting in or opting out, but we're happy to log it for you.
Exactly.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to seeing Manitou roll out its solution and to see the synergy that we've talked about today, seeing that grow.
Appreciate it, Paul. Thanks for the time.
Yep. Thank you very much, Paul. We really are looking forward to working with you.
Thank you for listening to Hedera Hashgraph's Gossip About Gossip. If you liked the episode, please subscribe, rate and review, and also share and tell your friends.
Or connect with us on social media like Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Hashgraph, particularly if you want to leave us feedback on the podcast. We look forward to hearing from you.